Right.
Thank you. Good evening and welcome on a cold and snowy 2nd of February 2021 to this Edinburgh TUC COVID-19 committee meeting entitled Climate Change and COVID. The world's been living with COVID-19 virus for over a year. Everything we see in the media right now relates to the difficulties faced by countries from the coronavirus. And yet the problems that we were concerned about have not gone away. When lockdowns came across the globe, we saw empty streets, seas and skies. The traffic, which had been contributing to climate change, had temporarily stopped. We saw amazing photographs from before and after lockdowns from many countries where smog and air pollutants had cleared, fish returning to the canals of Venice, giving us hope that the earth might be able to heal itself given half a chance. That it might not be too late to avoid major climate changes across the planet. But even if we completely stopped emitting greenhouse gases today, global warming would continue to happen as it takes decades, if not centuries, for the planet to respond. And because carbon dioxide lingers in the atmosphere for hundreds of years, there'll still be a lag between what we do and when we feel it. So what effect has the pandemic had on climate change? Has it given us a brief chance to organise and act differently to save our planet and ourselves? Or caused greater barriers to being able to change our ways? Tonight, we're delighted to welcome two speakers. The first is Pete Cannell. Pete is active in Scot.E3, Employment, Energy and Environment, and is a member of UCU. He'll speak to us and then answer questions that we have relating to what he said. And then we'll hear from our second speaker, Michael Crighton from Just Transition Partnership, which was formed from Friends of the Earth, Scotland and STUC in 2016. Membership includes Scottish branches of Unison, UCU, CWU, PCS and WWF. Like Pete, he'll take questions on his contribution and then we'll go into open discussion. So if you'd like to ask either Pete or Michael a question, just indicate by giving me a wave or put your hand up in the chat and I'll try to bring you in the right order. So if there are no other housekeeping issues, may I welcome Pete Cannell and invite him to begin.
Okay, thank you, Claire. Really pleased to be here this evening and pleased to be speaking with Matthew. And really, I suppose, quite eager to get to the part of discussion the evening when we go into discussion, because I'm absolutely sure there's lots of ideas and experience in the meeting, which would be really good to share. So I suppose I wanted to start, I mean, Matthew and I have kind of divided things up between us a bit. I wanted to start by something which I think probably underpins both of our contributions. When we look at both crises, the pandemic and the climate crisis, then I think we're probably behind what we say is understanding that for climate, we're in a situation where as more data emerges, some of the predictions that were made by the International Panel on Climate Change, for example, which always scientists' predictions are kind of cover a range of things, a range of possible outcomes. We're in a situation where the latest data suggests that we're on a trajectory at the moment, which is at the really worst end of that range. So temperatures are rising fast, ice is melting faster than was expected, and so on. So this is, without any doubt, an existential crisis. And again, as far as the pandemic's concerned, I just was watching the news tonight, and on one level, we're being offered hope through vaccination but much of the media coverage of that doesn't actually reflect also the kind of knife edge we're on, because for as long as transmission rates of COVID and infection rates of COVID are as high as they are, the risk of mutation is also very high. And the lead story on the news tonight was that the virus is mutating yet again in ways that are not fully understood, but actually certainly it's not good news. And at some point, you end up with mutations which the vaccines will not be able to deal with. And Independent Sage in particular, and I think the Zero COVID campaign as well, make a really strong case that what we need to do is drive down levels of infection, what people sometimes refer to as a Zero COVID strategy. But what I want to do quite briefly in my introduction is just to say that there's a link between COVID and climate, which is much, much stronger than simply the fact that they're happening at the same time. And I want to go, I know people in the meeting will be familiar with some of these things, but I think it's worth just outlining them. First of all, climate change and environmental destruction is right at the heart of the reason why we're going through this pandemic just now. I mean, what we've seen in the last recent decades is an ever accelerating rate of clearance of tropical and semi-tropical forests around the world. These were and certainly were the most biodiverse places on the planet, the host to an immense range of biological life. And that includes actually many, many kinds of viruses which have lived quite happily in their host species for a long time. But as human activity encroaches on places which were kind of not encroached on before, the possibility of those viruses crossing species boundaries becomes much, much greater. And that's what certainly scientists have been aware of for a considerable period of time now. And certain kinds of viruses, and it's probably the case with COVID, we don't know for sure. I mean, some of the species that are being encroached on, like bats, for example, are very particular in the sense that their systems operate at much higher temperatures than ours. The temperature is about 50 degrees centigrade. So the viruses that they have are used to operating in that kind of environment. When viruses that were in bats cross to humans, then they have a field day really, because they're much, much more likely to be aggressive and survive. And most scientists believe that we've been lucky that we've had as few instances of viruses crossing the species barrier already, and that certainly until we begin to get a grip on environmental destruction and until we halt the climate crisis, we are going to be living in an age when pandemics are very likely. So, there's a simple response to that, I think, that public health and pandemic planning has got to be is essential. And we need a longer term strategy so that we can live safely in the face of recurrent pandemic. Now, actually, up until relatively recently, Britain had a huge amount of expertise which was actually acted upon in terms of contingency plans for pandemics. But from the start of the current millennium, they were basically thrown in the bin. They weren't updated. Public health infrastructure was trashed, and our ability to respond effectively to pandemics was hugely damaged. So what I want to argue really is that climate crisis and environmental crisis are intimately linked, and they're driven by a system that puts profit before people, and that actually we need a radical systemic change in order to tackle both the climate crisis and recurrent pandemics. And I haven't got time to go into detail over this, but I think it's clear that we do have the knowledge and the expertise to do this. It's evident from the experience we've had in the crisis, the money's there. I mean, many of us argued previously that when threats are big enough, and they often were wartime threats, then the state redeploys resources to confront them. And that certainly happened with the pandemic, although because of the nature of the policies that have been pursued, the main beneficiaries of this increased state intervention have been a very small number of billionaires. So their net wealth has increased by something like $1 trillion in the time that the pandemic has been around. And I think it's important to note when people say, where's the money going to come from if you're going to actually do the kinds of things we need to tackle the climate crisis and tackle the pandemic properly, that actually there's been some really, really serious studies of the amount of resources needed. And they're fairly comparable to the sums of money that billionaires have actually accrued during this crisis. So it's not that the money isn't there, it's in the wrong hands. And many of the things that we need to do in order to tackle both COVID and climate actually cross over and have reinforce each other. So I'll just give one or two examples, and I'm sure people will think of many more. I mean, at the moment, we're facing a situation where public transport is in crisis, but were we taking a serious strategic approach? We would be understanding that we need to redesign public transport systems so that they're both carbon-free and sustainable for the future, but they're also safe to use, and that would mean new features of design and so on. Similarly with housing, we need to build zero carbon houses, but we also need to retrofit housing stock. And one of the things you need to do in that is actually make sure that they're really well ventilated and that the kind of health standards for them are actually as good as the carbon standards. Again, we know how to do that, but it's not clear that anybody's really doing it. Other kinds of things, workplaces for the construction and maintenance of renewables can be much safer in relation to the spread of virus infection than oil and gas rigs. I mean, the sight of oil and gas workers continuing to move up and down the East Coast, going out onto the rigs, significant outbreaks at the moment, is just ridiculous. So all of these things and many more are technically possible and good for health and good for the environment. And at the end of the day, the consequences of both climate crisis and COVID, and we're living through that right now, is increased poverty, increased unemployment. And the solutions to both COVID and climate crisis are things which also actually deal with some of those issues too. So in order to construct a new sustainable economy that works for the long term and actually tackles the climate crisis, we need in Scotland probably at least 100,000 climate jobs which contribute to making that transition. But one of the things that I know has been discussed in these COVID subcommittee meetings before as well, is that it isn't simply, for me, climate jobs, and for Scot E3, it's something we've talked about and written about quite a lot. Climate jobs aren't just jobs in kind of wind farms or retrofitting houses and so on. There are also jobs in what some people call the social reproduction centre. They're about care, okay? Jobs in the health service, jobs in social care are all zero carbon jobs, and they're part of actually the kind of seriously sustainable society that we need. And if we're going to confront, if living in an age of pandemics, we're going to have to learn how to live in that age until we've actually managed to eliminate the causes of pandemics. Then care jobs, as we've experienced in the last little while, is just so important, and we need to make sure that the case is made for them on a large scale too. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to put, later on, I'll put a couple of links in the chat to things that I've mentioned, and you can follow up. But happy to take some questions, or if there isn't questions at the moment, I think Matthew will come in and then we can go into discussion. So thanks.
Excuse me, thank you very much, Pete. It was fascinating. I wonder if anybody's got a question that they want to ask Pete just now. See any hands? I'm just going along the list. I can see one. Who's this? Oh, I've got a couple now, thank you. I've got Anne Morgan and then Kathy Jenkins, please. Anne, can I invite you in?
Thank you. And I tell you, Pete, that was just the best 20 minutes or so that I've heard of late. It was so good, and thank you. I just want kind of question, kind of comment on the care. We're going to need a lot of care. We're going to need a lot of creative care, because mental health, I don't really like the term lockdown, because it's used in prisons when there's an incident. I prefer just to talk about restrictions, but the restrictions have meant for people of my age, quite serious isolation. So as we bring people out of shielding and out of restrictions, we're going to need a lot of care and a lot of creative types of care. The Scottish Socialist Party are spearheading a national care service to bring care into public ownership, which I support 100%, because privatisation has been a disaster. However, there is sometimes a tendency for council care maybe not to be as creative and as sort of service user, if that's a reasonable term, responsive. So yes, for a national care service, yes, for expanded care, and yes, that should be considered within a climate job strategy.
Thank you very much, Anne. Can we go to Kathy now?
Hi, yeah, thank you. That was, yeah, brought together a lot of things. I just have two comments, really, or questions, I suppose. One is that, you know, you did mention the workplace, and I would just really emphasize, given that that's my kind of area of health and safety, is that what we've found during the pandemic is not only do we need more investment and more support for the health services and for social care, as you say, but also for enforcement and regulation in the workplace. So we've really suffered during the pandemic from years and years of cutbacks to the health and safety executive, years and years of cutbacks to local authority environmental health. And, you know, they are toiling to try to keep up in this situation. And, you know, I know personally many of them who are working very hard, but they're in deep trouble. And you also mentioned about money, and, you know, it's just been announced that £7 million is being paid by the government to employ a private company to do HSE inspections, which is just crazy. And it's presumably because they don't have any inspectors left, because they've lost so many over the years. But the linked thing to that is, I wondered if either you or Matthew or, you know, whoever could comment on the new, what's it called, CPTPP treaty that the UK is trying to enter, the Pacific trade deal, because my reading of it is that the labour and environmental protections in that treaty are pretty poor. Thank you.
I don't know if you want to come back on that just now, Pete.
Yeah, I see that Ian Mullin's got his hand up.
Thank you. So we'll go straight to Ian then.
Thanks, Pete. Found that really interesting. In my younger days, I was actually a member of Greenpeace, and you know, I was really quite into environmental issues and how we could incorporate them into an industrial workplace. I work for Edinburgh City Council. I think one of the real fundamental problems that we've got, and I've had a work with some senior managers there recently, is management's attitude towards environmental improvements in the workplace. We have a really large fleet garage at Russell Road in Edinburgh, and there's a tank in there which holds 42,000 gallons of used oil for the fleet services. Now, I'm going back 20 years ago when I actually went up to the senior management team, and I'd read an article in the Greenpeace magazine saying that you could convert heat and light. You could burn the oil from old services to create heat and light. And I'm going back 20 years ago. This would have made its money 10 times over had they actually invested in that system 20 years ago. And it would have meant that we were carbon neutral in the fleet garages at Russell Road. And when I was explaining this to a senior manager recently, I said to him, do you know what we should have done as well? We've got two massive big super depots in Edinburgh, at Bankhead and at Seafield, and they were planning a third one. And I asked him, he didn't know at this time, but I have the plans for them. But I asked him if we had any solar paneling on the roof. And when he said that he thought there was, and I corrected him, because I know there isn't, I cannot imagine spending millions of pounds on a super depot now without even considering solar panels to do the heating and the lighting. And I really do think we've got a fundamental problem in changing the attitude of senior management and elected members. Thanks.
Would you like to come in, Des, or Pete, would you like to answer those questions or those statements?
Yeah. Okay, well, just two things really. First, and both stemming, one from Kathy and also from Kathy and Ian as well. I mean, I think the straight answer to the new Pacific initiative, Kathy, is that it's a classic neoliberal free trade initiative. And I mean, in one sense, that connects into something I didn't talk about, but I thought probably would come up in discussion, which is that we're going to hear a great deal this year about all kinds of initiatives. And I suspect, although I haven't looked at the detail of it, that it's probably mentioned in the new Pacific Agreement too, which is that the British government to start with, but other governments as well, in the lead up to COP26 in the tail end of this year, will be falling over themselves to talk about the fact that they're adopting net zero projects, initiatives and policies. And one of the things we need to do as both climate activists and as trade union activists and socialist activists is to become much more critical about when they say these things, because net zero, put really crudely, means that we'll carry on emitting just as much or more usually for the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years. And we'll expect that we can somehow drag that back by technological means, mostly through direct air capture of carbon or through what's called BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. I mean, these things are just cloud cuckoo land. They're greenwashing. The BECCS part of it, if you added together already existing schemes that they're talking about doing, would take the surface area of about 4 planet Earths of vegetation to create the carbon sink that they're talking about. So it's nonsense. Now, I'm just going to say, that leads me to my second kind of response, really, partly to Kathy's question and also to Ian's question as well, about being in the workplace, because it seems to me that over the next few years, as workplace activists, we're going to have to be not climate experts in the kind of scientific sense of the word, or knowledgeable about every aspect of either climate or epidemiology, but we do need to have some very clear and sharp ideas about when we're having the wool drawn over our eyes. Net zero is a good example, but there are plenty of others. And we need to think really hard about how we can then turn the kind of politics of that and the issues about where we want to go, turn those into kind of action that makes things happen in the workplace. Because although this is a global issue, it involves big picture solutions. Some of that will be made up of initiatives from below, and partly winning hearts and minds will have to be done at grassroots level. It won't just be done by diktat from above. So it's really important that we do that, and that it's one of the things that Scot E3 has been trying to do, is to produce resources that kind of arm people to have those discussions and those arguments, and to be able to take on their employers when they're telling them things which sound superficially attractive, but actually are nonsense and not measuring up to the scale of the problem we face.
Thanks, Pete. Des, do you want to come in now? You're on mute. Okay.
Yeah, just wanted to raise the issue of vaccinations. I think it is linked to what we're discussing. I mean, we're in the midst of a vaccination campaign in the UK, but some of the media is saying that we should be helping other countries who haven't got access to vaccines. We should make sure that they do get access to vaccines, because otherwise this disease will continue to run rampant for years, and there'll be more and more mutations which will inevitably affect us. And I think coping with COVID in that sense is very important to coping with all the changes produced by climate change. So I just wonder if Pete's got any comment on, or whether he thinks the whole vaccination issue and vaccinating the world, so to speak, is part of the debate.
Do you want to come in just now, Donnie, and then Pete's got a couple of things to talk on?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to follow up what Pete was talking about in terms of the workplace and how it's really, really important that the issues about climate are brought up in there. And I don't know if people have heard about Rolls-Royce Aeronautics at Barnoldswick, because what they did, they were facing 300 job redundancies. They went on strike. This is a couple of months ago, actually, right in the middle of the pandemic. The way that they were able to pick it was they actually had a cavalcade of about 150 cars that drove through the town. It's up somewhere, I think, in the northwest, I'm not sure, of England. And they were successful, but what's really wonderful about it was not only did they save the jobs, but because aeronautics is in a major crisis, they're converting to actually producing, doing research and into renewables. So the whole, this is exactly, when we're talking about transition, I was going to hold back until, I apologize, Matthew, if you're going to talk about it, but Pete did bring it up. So this is the absolute model of what we need to do, but it requires the strength of the workers, because it was a big strike and they had to hold together and carry it through. But the logic for them was not to go back to producing things that destroy the planet, but actually producing things that will save our lives. Thanks.
Anne, do you want to come in just now?
Yeah, thanks. I'll try and be brief for the next speaker. Responding to Pete and to Donnie, Pete mentioned the problem of BECCS, and the problem of direct air capture, carbon-wise. There is not enough discussion, in my view, about the rollout of so-called blue hydrogen. I wrote a paper for the Scot E3 WordPress on the topic, because the Scottish Government are very committed to it, and they've put their money where their mouth is. And St Fergus, just north of Aberdeen, is ready for a rollout by mid-decade for the blue hydrogen. And there's a lot of talk of the hydrogen economy without defining the difference between green hydrogen and blue hydrogen. I won't comment on green hydrogen because I'm in the process of trying to find out if it really would be a good thing. But blue hydrogen's not a good thing, in my opinion, because it requires the storage of CO2 underneath the North Sea, which will be very expensive and perhaps risky. So the whole idea of a hydrogen economy is being mooted. The Dieter Helm on the Economic Advisory Group is a big fan, but he's also a friend of fossil. And I'll finish with this because Donnie was talking about aerospace going into better socially useful renewable construction. The Lucas plan is worth. The Lucas plan revived is worth a look at. But oh, sorry, I've lost my plot here. I was going to finish on something to do with hydrogen again. Oh yes, Patrick Harvey. Patrick Harvey said, putting climate mitigation in the hands of fossil, that's Shell, Total, BP, they're Blue Dot, they're up at St Fergus, is like putting the tobacco industry in charge of public health. So it gets back to that old chestnut, who's driving the show here.
Thanks very much for that, Anne. Willie, I see your hand up. Would you like to come in just now?
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to take up Ian's issue and point about 10 years ago and shop stewards or activists raising. I think there's a plan to try and see if we. I'm not in favour of getting rid of shop stewards, because I believe the shop steward system and the rep system and the office rep systems should be maintained and expanded and developed by the union organisations. But I do think there's an attention, like health and safety reps, to have green reps, but that can be health and safety reps, or it could be shop stewards. But I definitely think that it's now time for the trade union to see that they've got a role in challenging the type of things that Ian, in his particular work, had some answers to the totality of climate. And I was watching the other day there, this whole argument about if what's happening with the virus, it's raised such a wide argument about the role of the state and the way that we deal with things on a worldwide basis. Anybody who turns around and says it can't be done, or this can't be done, are in real difficulties, because the only answer to COVID is to have a world answer, the vaccination, but also more than that, the whole question of how we operate around what was being raised, the question of care, health, the social side of the society that we live in. And I think that that's really a good thing. I know the last point I would want to raise was the whole question about the state. Now, many of us don't believe that the state is the answer, but nevertheless, right now, states are probably part of the answer on how we deal with the immediate, but also in the present climate. I heard the other day there that the main polluters in Britain, if not the world, are mainly state-owned, or that they have state contracts on a massive scale, that there is only something in the region of 10% of the main polluters in the world that are actually private companies. Now that changes the nature of what we have to demand. If the state says that it's for zero carbon, then what does it do with the contracts? What does it do with the companies that it technically owns, right? I know that we're in a capitalist world, and I'm not pretending it's an easy fix here, But nevertheless, that could be done in conjunction with billions of people doing a contribution at a local level, whether that's at a community level or an individual level, to deal with climate. So I think that if we examine the polluters, we find that their hands are in the trough, or their noses are in the trough, and we can always snap that trough shut if things aren't done in the proper manner. So I think there's big leverages and levers that we can demand, but we also have to fight in the here and now in our communities, but also in our workplaces, through maybe green reps being recognised and being developed by TUC education courses and all the usual things. I know we're in a speed up, but at least it could be a start to how people operate in their own workplaces. And if they're given some legal status, it means they can challenge the management in bringing forward ideas, and workforces can be part of that. Sorry.
Well, sounds great, Lily. Thanks for that. Simon, do you want to come in just now?
Yeah, hi. So my question is on workplaces. It seems clear that for a lot of people, their workplace is going to be their home indefinitely, and maybe even after the pandemic has gone away. Just employers sometimes quite like that. How do we make sure that that's an environmental positive and not a negative? Is there less transport, but then if everybody's heating their own home inefficiently, is it better or worse? So how do we make sure of that?
Magic, thanks, Simon. Right, Pete, there's a lot going on there, from vaccination to blue hydrogen. I wonder if you want to come back in now.
Yeah, okay. I'll be quick, because I think it probably would be good if Matthew has a chance to get in. Two particularly direct questions, I think there. One, Des, on vaccination. And I think we have to be really clear that vaccination by itself is not going to be the solution. But vaccination, to be effective, has to be global too. And at the moment, with the inequalities of wealth that exist on a global scale, people are talking about maybe 5, 6 years before the poorest countries in the world get to have comprehensive vaccination programs. And that's just not good enough. And actually, in that time, there is the potential for a significant number of vaccination of mutations, for the current vaccines to be become useless, and so this is not kind of forecasting doom for the sake of it. It's being realistic. What we need is a strategy, a global strategy that drives levels of infection right down. First of all, that minimizes mutations, but it also makes it then easier for a comprehensive vaccination program to be successful. And fortunately, that's an idea that most scientists espouse, I think. I mean, we've been told that governments follow the science. I mean, they say they follow the science. What they actually do is follow the short-term political expediency most of the time, and the interests of profit and big business. But we have to make sure that genuinely that science is followed. And those ideas are becoming popular. I mean, there's a zero COVID campaign in the UK, but it's actually spawned a really seriously large zero COVID campaign in Germany now, for example. And it's an idea whose time has come, and we have to win it. The other thing, I think Simon's question about the workplace and home working is a really, really important one. And there's a whole number of dimensions, which I won't go into, but other people may want to pick up later on in discussion. I mean, I think it poses challenges, but also opportunities for the way we organize, the links between workplace and community and so on. But just one example, I think, really, it also raises policy issues as well. So, for example, if you look at Edinburgh City Council's plan for aiming towards net zero, and there's a lot behind that net which we need to be critical of by somewhere on the way to that by 2030. It takes as granted the crazy ways in which we organize the way we live and the way we work at the moment. So, over the last 2 or 3 decades, people live further and further away from their work because they can't afford to live close to their work. We have transport systems based on bringing huge numbers of people into Edinburgh during the day and then taking them back again during the night. Not happening at the moment, but mostly when politicians talk about getting things back to normal, that's the kind of normal they have in mind. And we need to say, actually, that was never normal or acceptable. We need ways that are community friendly, worker friendly, people friendly in terms of the way we live and the way we organize ourselves. And we won't get that without actually both very serious resistance and struggle on our part, but also we need to have some sharp ideas. And those ideas, I think, could be really popular because they relate to decent working conditions, decent living conditions, and talking about the way people can spend more time with their kids, more time with their families, and so on, and not spend their time stuck on the M8 for 4 hours a day going to work or whatever their current experience is. So I think that's enough for me anyway.
Thanks very much, Pete, and thanks for everybody for your contributions so far. Callum's got a couple of things in the chat as well, so if you want to add to those, please feel free. On to our second speaker then. This is Michael Crighton from Just Transition Partnership. Thank you, Michael.
I think you'll find Michael was the world's...
Oh, I beg your pardon. I do beg your pardon, Matthew.
I didn't write any airport novels.
I'm so sorry.
I'll tell you what.
My apologies.
Just a very quick background. From my own point of view, I've been an environmentalist and a trade unionist for a long time, but for a long time I was much more involved in my union at Unison than I was on the environmental side. But around 2004-05, I realized that climate change was a challenge which kind of nobody really seemed to be facing up to, certainly not in the trade union movement. And since then, I've become more involved in climate change activism, mostly through Friends of the Earth Edinburgh, Friends of the Earth Scotland. And bringing those two sort of strands of work together has been very important for me, and has culminated most in a sense by the creation of the Just Transition Partnership in 2016, which was an initiative, as you've already said, Claire, by the Scottish Trade Union Congress and Friends of the Earth Scotland. And it happened around about the time of that first round of losses of jobs in oil and gas, which I'll come back to. So I'll tell you what I'm going to do, and just check in that that's all right. And then I'll do it. I'll make a few comments on what Pete said, but quickly. I'll tell you how the trade unions and the Just Transition Partnership have orientated towards the issues of climate change, and some of the sort of the politics in Scotland around that. And then I'll relate that to the issues around green recovery from COVID, and the way that's playing out, and then try and bring it together around the kind of what pulls it all together. So unless anyone says that's a bad idea, I'm going to crack on. So firstly, just on COVID and the overlaps between COVID and climate change, these kind of crises, they're on the one hand, they're on very different timescales, and in a sense also very different in terms of like how the scale of the consequence of failing to tackle climate change is even greater than the scale of the consequence of not tackling COVID-19. But they have lots of similar qualities. And the only things I'm going to comment on here now is that they're certainly about our relationship with nature, which means that they're external to the economy, which poses the absolutely core question is how do you manage your economy in such a way that you achieve social goals, the social goals of avoiding climate catastrophe, the social goal of protecting people from COVID-19. On that basis, you also find that the same principles apply when you come to deal with them. so without going into all of that straight away, they have to be publicly driven solutions, not market-driven solutions. They have to be pro-people and pro-nature. And this necessarily requires a break with the way that the economy is run. Essentially, at the minimum, a break with neoliberalism, possibly a break with capitalism. So that's just my sort of additional point to what we had discussed earlier. I think at the time when I became interested in this, I think it's true to say that trade unions were not focusing on climate change at all. And it's also true to say that the environmental movement wasn't working much with the trade unions. There were two movements in parallel, pretty much. So that's why I thought the Just Transition Partnership set up around this idea of just transition, which is an idea which came out of the trade union movement, was potentially so useful. So it has become a place where the environment, climate change movement, and the trade unions have met and worked out shared positions, and I'd say learnt from each other. And without, you know, since I've worked on this for some time, I can talk at great length, but I'll try and just focus down on the framework which that has been able to present. It's definitely about the need for change particularly in the economic sphere, and the importance of protecting workers and communities in those economic changes. It's also a recognition that that hasn't happened. When I can, I'll post in the chat a link to our founding statement, and that's what we were saying back in 2016. So there's a degree of urgency. There's also a degree of there's a need to include justice and inclusion issues into climate change policies and how we deal with climate. Not just because we think it's good that people should be protected if change is happening, it's actually also because we actually won't get a just transition, and we won't get any transition at all unless how we do it is popular. Unless we take people with us and people see that through stopping climate change, we will make our society better and we will solve problems which people are facing. We won't have enough weight behind that to mobilize people in the way that is necessary, because there's lots and lots of resistance to doing the obvious thing. And lastly, on that point, there's a strong emphasis on within the idea of just transition, of participation, of trade unions and workers and communities engaging in the process of change. And I think Bonnie's comment about Barnolds, it was very, very, very cheering in that respect. So I'll just say very quickly what happened after we set up the Just Transition Partnership. Seemed to be an idea whose time has come, because quite quickly the government, Scottish government, said, "Oh, that's great, let's have a Just Transition Commission," which is something we had asked for. And it took a long time to set it up. So when you've just got to hold in your mind that there are two very similar sounding things. One's us, the partnership, one's the commission. And the commission was set up in a different way from what we would have liked. It's got a lot of sectoral interests on it. It's got people who, as it were, represent or part of the oil industry, of the chemical industry, of the electricity, energy industry, farming, and so on. And it's got a number of other people, and a couple of trade unionists, and one environmentalist. So on that basis, since you've got a bunch of people in the commission who hadn't actually got any prior involvement with just transition ideas, it's been a place where those trade unionists and environmentalists have been arguing through the case. And the outcome is that there's quite a lot of good stuff come out of the commission, which I'll just, for example, very, very clear that you need sectoral plans for a just transition, particularly in energy, particularly on buildings, particularly in food and farming, and on transport and industry in general. It's taken up this issue of supply chain jobs, i.e. the BIFAB crisis, in inverted commas. It's taken up the fact that Scotland and the UK have created a lot of renewable energy generation and almost no manufacturing jobs from that. And it's been the work of the trade unionists on that commission to make them do that. But they have been pretty clear about it. And I'm just on that, I'll say our view is far from it being great that the Scottish government has embraced just transition and everything's going swimmingly. there's currently an unjust transition going on, not a just transition. We are seeing BIFAD yards closing. We are seeing those people who used to work there who could be making renewables infrastructure not working there. We've seen people losing their jobs in the oil and gas industry in a disorganized way. So we must call out any idea that Scotland is leading on just transition. It's leading on having a commission on just transition. That's one of my rants. Another thing that the commission has said is this idea of conditionality. It is that wherever the government supports a private company, particularly in recovery from the COVID economic crisis, it should require that they create plans to get to a net zero place. I.e., they could be called just transition plans, or they could be called Paris alignment plans, but that they should be conditional. So these are all things that it's great that the Commission is saying. I'll just note that it isn't saying, for example, what we would say, which is that public ownership has to be a crucial element of driving this forward. We're also saying, it isn't saying this, that we have to have actual targets for job creation, targets for improving the labour market and making it more inclusive. It isn't saying that the trade unions have to have a central role. And basically, it's not really talking about just transition as if it could be transformational. So that's where we've got in terms of, as I said, the approach which we've worked out around just transition between the trade unions and the environmental movement. So when I connect that to COVID-19, the first thing to say, and I think it's really important to be able to assert this in any conversation that you have, even though the COVID-19 lockdown has created a reasonably substantial fall in emissions, this does not show how this should happen. This is, we don't think that in order to achieve a really radical drop in emissions, you have to have a lockdown. You have to stop people enjoying themselves. You have to stop them going out. It mustn't be about life getting harder. That's not the solution we're trying to put forward. And also, just to note that the degree of fall in those emissions is about what we need. We've got to carry on at the same rate, but we've got to do it in a radically different way. So when you hear Boris Johnson actually uses the phrase "build back better." Right? When you hear that, you have to ask yourself, so are we building back better? And I think I won't go over it too long, but Pete's already said, the rich are getting richer. Many, many people are really stretched. And we've had to have trade unions taking action even to defend their members at work in terms of PPE, health and safety, and so on. Frontline workers get ill. Sadly, many are dying. So sadly, just like the just transition isn't happening, it's also true that the just and green recovery isn't happening. And in that relationship, I just want to talk about the campaign set up around the idea of a just and green recovery. It's a broad alliance initiated mostly out of Friends of the Earth Scotland. I'll copy a link to it very soon. And Unison, CWU, EIS, UCU and Prospect are all trade unions that are a member of that and members of that. And it's, I think, been very successful in bringing together a very wide alliance across what you call civic society around some absolutely key broad principles, which do include climate change, but they also about protecting people through public service and transforming the economy in those other ways as well. So I'll try and get you that link in a moment. So how do these all sort of link together, at least in my hand? On the one hand, we've got the downside, you might say, that we've become aware of the consequences of austerity for our capacity to deal with COVID-19, and at the same time, the running down of public services has weakened the NHS and social services and local authorities. These are also the services we need if we are going to take a really upbeat, rapid, dramatic plan to reduce our emissions. By contrast, as we know, certainly the UK government has undermined the attempts to deal with the pandemic by its insistence on using private companies and going around the NHS and outsourcing. We've seen the failures of test, track and trace in Scotland as well as England. Clearly echo those people who say that that we need a major mobilization to repair that damage. On the other hand, we do have to recognize that the furlough scheme, although, I mean, it's hard to sort of rejoice about it, but it is a recognition by the state, which to some extent we've won, that it's an absolutely crucial role of the state to protect people and workers in a time of crisis like this. And as someone else has noticed, the capacity to mobilize resources financially, to get the Bank of England to print money and allow it to enable that furlough scheme, has given us all the confidence that faced with an existential crisis, we can act, as Willie says, through the state at this moment. And in that sense, it means that the questions we're dealing with is, how do we get the state to act, not just to protect our lives and our livelihoods in the short run, but how do we get the state to act for the protection of humanity and nature in the longer run? I think we are building the alliances and the foundations of a movement which can do that. It's a battle. The strength has to be developed as we go through. So I've just tried to. I felt that I've tried to both cover the way trade unions in Scotland have dealt with climate change, and then apply that to how we collectively and as trade unionists are dealing with COVID, and hopefully drawn out some of the common strands. And at that point, I will let you all talk a bit more about it, and I welcome all the insights that you'll bring to that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Matthew. Having a look down my list to see if I can see anybody who wants to come in, ask Matthew a question. I have a little look in the chat as well. We've got comments from Kathy, from Pete, from Kathy Woodcock also. So I have Anne would like to come in.
Hi, does somebody else want to go first? I'm just collecting my notes here.
Oh, sorry, Anne, I'll just have a look down the list again. I didn't see any other hands just now, though.
Do you want me just to say what I was going to say, Chair? Sorry, I've forgotten your name, calling you Chair. Okay. That's not very nice, is it? Thank you. Simon, was Simon that asked about working at home. My concern would be that being organised in the workplace is one of the few places where we can make things happen and protect workers. Now, it may be that a lot of the call centres and whatnot were not well organised, unionised anyway, but it would suit the monsters that we have reduced opportunities in terms of organising, and working at home would be really, keeping people separate. So I would hope that the unions can get jiggy with how to organise workers home that are working from home. And then I had a wee comment on what Michael said around solutions, carrying the people with the solutions to be popular. Now I'm thinking of very ordinary things like good homes, warm homes, decent public transport. And from our work here in Glasgow around public transport, there's very few people that don't agree that, better buses And for me, decarbonised buses would be a very good idea. Shuttle buses for workplaces, you name it. Redesign public transport. I think that's the way Pete put it. The problem is, for me, I posted a wee picture of myself yesterday because I was outside city chambers with a wee sign that said, make public transport public. We were all stood out in the rain. And it seems to me that we're always out in the cold. I mean, I've been on the streets since the 60s, 70s. COP26 is rolling into town and there'll be a steel fence around the ACCC. It's how to influence. It's not for me, Michael, that these initiatives or these campaigns or these ideas lack popularity. It's about how do we get a participatory democracy? How do we get economic democracy? Andy Cumbers from Glasgow University is very good on that subject, about how workers, bus drivers, you name it, the example of the aerospace workers, the Lucas workers, how do we influence? Because I would say, in terms of my points about blue hydrogen, where the Scottish populace consulted about which type of economy we want to have. I don't want to continue fossil. Blue hydrogen is reforming methane, which doesn't do much for the greenhouse gas effect. There's a lack of consultation, there's a lack of participation, there's a lack of way to influences, because mostly what we are talking about, I think, would be very popular.
Thanks very much, Anne. We've got Des, then Kathy, then Willie, please.
I think what I want to say in reaction to what Matthew said is that Edinburgh is facing an economic catastrophe over the next year or two. The airport, which employs 3,000 people, is currently working at 10 or 15% capacity. There's issues of buses, all forms of transport. The tourist industry is talking about losing 30,000 jobs. But they talk about normality being returned to the status quo before COVID. But actually, I don't think that's possible. But even if it was possible, I think we've got an issue which should engage the public, is basically how in the next year or two do we in Edinburgh go about creating, or the Scottish Government goes about creating 30 to 40,000 jobs. That's what I think is going to have to be done, the creation of 30 to 40,000 jobs. And those 30 or 14 jobs have to be environmental friendly job if we're looking at the long term. And it means we have to invest in all sorts of things, but including education and social care. But I mean, it's a real live issue. It's been hidden up till now. There hasn't been that much debate about it. But to me, it's an issue that's just a few months away when unemployment will start going through the roof. And in Edinburgh alone, I'm not talking about the rest of Scotland, and how we solve that problem is going to be a major, I'm willing to bet money that by the time we get to June, July, August, how we solve that problem is going to be a major political issue. And we and the left have to get our oar in, so to speak, and put forward our proposals for solving the unemployment problem. Thanks.
Thanks, Des. Kathy, I'll bring you in here.
Yeah, it was just a couple of things. One was in relation to what Anne said about organising, understanding the difficulties of organising people who are increasingly working from home. And, I don't at all deny that that is going to be a huge problem, but there has been quite a lot of, I think, quite innovative work being done in terms of trade unions over the COVID period and using electronic, using Zoom and everything, all the other platforms. And I think if we can hold on to that learning and build that in, we should be able to, we'll have a start at least in doing that. And certainly I know trade unions have actually gained in membership, which nobody expected over the COVID period, for lots of reasons, obviously. The second thing is I really thought I might just ask you all, given that some of you are reps and everything, is I put in the chat earlier that before the 2008 recession, or whatever you want to call it, there had been quite a movement to move from health and safety reps to health, safety and environment reps. And that kind of got lost, I think, because trade unions were firefighting on jobs. And of course, now they're firefighting on COVID. But I would be really interested in people's perception about which would be better, to have green reps separately with statutory powers, the way that health and safety reps do, or widening the remit of the health and safety rep to include environmental issues. So, I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I'd be quite interested.
Okay, Willie, can you come in just now here?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I remember in the 80s, Des, when we built the unemployed workers centres across, and we had the right to work marches and then the people's marches. I'm not sure if that's the particular answer, but that might be if we fail in other sides and other places, we might have to actually start organising unemployed workers. In the meantime, we need to fight back to get jobs in the economy, and that means raising the question of the climate type of jobs that we talked about, that Pete talked about, and that really needs to go further up the pole, as it were, and our demands and our immediate answers. Cathy talks about union organisation, and it's good, but you'll notice primarily it's where unions have said that they're going to fight, or they've actually mobilised to fight, that union membership is sharply taken a rise. And I think that that's an indication. And one of those unions was the National Education Union, that I believe they are saying that they had 22,000 on their their call. Now that is colossal. I can't even remember a factory that ever had a mass meeting of 22. Of course, we had demonstrations, 100,000, and or stop the war and the Iraq War and things like that. But as a union, that could take on what Cathy talks about, an educational role. We could be calling our members into these kind of Zooms in the short term to talk about big issues. And I think that you would find that, okay, it wouldn't be 22,000, but it could be thousands of people in workplaces or at home that are relating to a common cause and a common fight. I mean, I'll quote it because I always like quoting it, and maybe people will be shocked that I quote it. But Lenin wrote that the working class was a class in itself, i.e., whether you think you're working class or no, you're working class. But he also said that the working class had to be a class for itself. And that any opportunity that we get to be able to talk collectively and organize collectively as a class, that should be our #1 priority, because that's the solution. When people get together and they've got power, then they can change society. And I think that that's really where we're at with climate and with COVID. Zero COVID is a demand that has to be taken up centrally by the trade unions. But also, we need to organise a climate response in each workplace that then fits into the bigger picture of what we're demanding, or the world in which we live in, and can we make a better world, and another world is possible. So I think, Cathy, it might be that in a hybrid where the health and safety reps get an educational course or add on to their qualifications or added on to their the legal powers to take up the question of climate as well, and zero carbon. And that would be at least a start. And if we can jockey it onto that structure, then that might be a good thing, rather than going for a separate green rep that I was talking about. So I'm up for whatever is best, because time is really important. I mean, in Edinburgh, and I'll finish on this, Edinburgh Council talks about being carbon neutral by 2030. And I was just thinking, Christ, that's only 9 years. That's only 9 years for them to play and change the whole of the city, right? And the role that they play. And what Matthew talks about, the just transition or transition Edinburgh, is playing some of that role. But it needs trade unionists to join it. It needs to have power, and it needs to have political power to force the council to speed up, and also to involve the city workers that work for the council to be an ingredient in the solutions.
Kathy, do you want to come straight back on that? I see your hands up.
Oh no, I just didn't take it down. My apologies.
Okay, no worries. We'll go to Donny and then Ian then, please.
Thanks. I want to follow on straight from Willie. Just on the good news, Willie, it was 100,000 at the NEU thing, and 400,000 looked in, apparently. It's the biggest meeting that has ever been on that level. And it turned around the government in 24 hours in terms of opening up the primaries. I think Kathy's question is a really, really interesting one, because I'm safety rep at my college. And I also went on the only TUC course on the environment that there's been. And it was a really interesting event, because there's a difficulty. On the one hand, we want to bring it into the workplace and tie it into trade union activity, but at the same time, the sort of scale of action that you need, and the imagination and the mass demonstrations and the street activity that XR and the school students and all that bring, there's sort of, there's a distance between them. And what I'm worried about is that if you give the green role to the health and safety rep, it'll just sink because the safety rep's doing so many things. And I'll be very quick, but at our work, we have a real problem. I think it's a problem, actually, which is what you were saying about the council. My work, that my employer is saying, yes, we've got to get carbon neutral. And that's why it was really interesting to see hear what Pete said about what carbon neutral actually means. You know, we're going to do this, and we're going to do it ahead of everybody else. And we're in competition with all the other colleges to show how advanced we are. But actually, to get that sort of cutting edge where you get people campaigning and fighting against the system which creates the bloody thing. It's capitalism that has the carbon and puts the profits before the people. It's actually quite tricky, because we're being incorporated. I'm hoping that the COP26 and the sort of mass movement that is outside will tear it away from the Scottish government and all these governments that are pretending to do something, but actually are just greenwashing, as Pete was talking about. But it's actually quite a tricky thing. But just to finally, on Kathy's point, I think it depends on the level of union organisation and the size. If you've got a small workplace, then the health and safety rep has to double up. But anything big, I think you should have people that really focus on it and have it clearly in their minds, and they see the campaigns and they take it outside the workplace. Because the health and safety rep is inside the workplace. The campaign to stop climate change is in the workplace, but it's also very much outside. So I think both, I would go for both myself. Cheers.
No, I think I agree with you, Donny. I think it would be too much to try for one person to take on that role as well as health and safety within the workplace. We'll go to Ian now, and then I'll come back to Anne, if that's okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. I mean, I remember taking the environmental health course way back, probably 20 odd years ago, when I was convener for the TNG, and I haven't seen any environmental courses through trade unions, or certainly haven't seen them recently. But listening to what's been said tonight, I mean, I've got 3 roles in unison now. I'm the health and safety officer, service conditions, and I've recently taken on the education officer role as well. And I think I'm going to have a serious look at whether we can, unison, can start to run, even if it's only a branch, recognised environmental training course, because it is going to become, it's a big thing now, but it's going to become even bigger. I think I took inspiration last year when I went on the schools march down to Holyrood. And I think even it's 56, and having been a member of Greenpeace and done environmental studies before and worked in environmental health, that kind of rejuvenated me again, to be honest with you. And I think there's a lot that we can learn for the kids nowadays. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely, and thanks for that. Anne, do you want to come back in now?
Yes, thanks. This is really good debates, folks. I'm really quite heartened. Responding to Willie and Donnie and is it Cathy, green reps would be good. I liked Donnie's idea of coming outside, and I liked Willie's idea about organising unemployed people, because there's going to be many. I remember the days of the unemployed workers centres. There were good places to be. I went on many. I went right to work march. My friend and I used to have fun shouting the right not to work, because there's that issue, the right not to be forced into employment that's not suitable, that's far away, that's 0 hours contracts, and the terrible situation with the Department of Work and Pensions, imposition of sanctions if you don't take a job that doesn't suit. So there's the right not to work in crap jobs. And that's going to be horrendous benefits wise, and people losing jobs and being forced into jobs that maybe make life very difficult for them. So the right to work and the right not to work in crap jobs. But while I'm here, while I've got the virtual floor, I want to return to the idea of participatory democracy. I'm a veteran of campaigning. I was at the Million March in London against the Iraq War, and we went to war anyway. I'm sad for the Arab Spring. It's the 10th year anniversary, where there was millions upon millions on the streets. They got rid of, I can never pronounce his name, they got rid of the dictator, but currently the situation in Egypt is dire. The 60% are on or below the poverty line. So it's how to effect change. I'm really interested in places like Rojava, North Syria. They're getting whacked by Turkey, but I hope they survive. Borrowing from the Zapatistas, they organise from the bottom up in an eco-socialist and egalitarian way. And they say things like, demand's not enough, Willie, because demands often go unheard. We've kind of got to create anew. We've got to, like we're doing in Glasgow, with another Glasgow is possible, and there's another Edinburgh is possible. Imagine and bring on board the people who may be less organised, people who want decent houses, people who want decent jobs, people who want decent public transport. So just returning to what Donnie said, a Green rep could come, organise at a union level and come out and organise maybe with the unemployed, with the tenants' unions, with the living rents, and in a way linking up our campaigns so that we hopefully become more effective.
Great idea, yeah, absolutely, and thanks very much for that. Now I'm looking at the time and I'm mindful that poor Matthew has not had a chance to come back. There's been a lot of different comments from people, and I see my colleague Sophia has her hand up. Is it a question, Sophia, or are you just wishing to tell us about the time?
No, it's just a quick comment.
Go for it.
Yeah, okay, so really Anne said it a lot better than I was thinking to say, but I wanted to sort of like bring all of these things together. Cathy also said that maybe there are more members in the trade unions and kind of things like that. And I think this COVID period has helped us to communicate, because we use a lot more this online communication, which was available before, but we were not using it enough. And as a result of this, we have managed to reach different areas and kind of different people. And that is good in itself, but also the knowledge that we get from each other, brings the trade unions more center stage and link to other things except the specific work issues that each one of the trade unions are dealing with directly. So it brings the trade unions in more communication with other people. We have this event here, which is a trade union organized event, and anybody can come, different people who are not members of trade unions or anything. And this conversation stretches people's imagination, because the reason why we can't organize, people have no energy, is because people are not allowed anymore to imagine a different future. And the more we talk to each other across different experiences, the more the imagination opens up and we can visualize different worlds, and then people can act on them in different ways. And just to add, because Callum asked on the chat what we learned from trade unions from other countries and all of that, and then Pete added different things there. I think we can talk more now with trade unions from other countries, because we have these Zoom calls and we can find these people and we can do fascinating stuff, because the stuff that you hear in other countries, we learn things, we learn how they have won different fights, but also we feel the connection and how we are next to each other dealing with the same problems. And when we feel these remote connections, we get a lot more energy. So we have a list here with people, and we will think and organize some events and start talking to people from other countries. That would be fascinating. So yeah, thank you, Claire. That was it.
Thanks, Sophia. Yeah, absolutely. I think that would be really fascinating to hear from other countries. Now, Matthew, would you like to come back in here?
Yeah, I always want to speak if I get a chance. I thought that was a really interesting and helpful conversation. I'll just comment on a few bits of it. First of all, Anne's point about participation, and obviously, this is like something we all aspire to, and we should remember to focus on that. I've just only got 2 points about it, really. The first is that it would be great to have a government which actually encourages trade unions and workers' participation in these processes, because at the moment they don't even actually talk about it. But there's a bit of lip service. But when I'm saying that there must be conditions attached to support to companies and indeed to public agencies around getting to Paris alignment or net zero. And the conditions also ought to be, and you must talk to your workforce through their unions. The government could take a really big step in helping trade unions and giving them the opportunities to engage with people to recruit in workplaces by saying, no, it's got to happen. Come on, that's part of the deal. But also on that point, it is a really big challenge for us to work out how to engage with workers on these issues. And I'll just give you a positive example about this, which is that Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace and Platform did a survey of offshore workers in the North Sea. And this has been, just talking to people about the really poor conditions under which they work, now what a bad time they're having, and giving them a space and a voice has already started to change attitudes across government and other places, and to some extent in the unions, I think, to those issues. But in that survey, the point I'm making is that almost none of these 1,300 1,300 workers who replied had ever heard of the term just transition. Right. So, 2 points there before I go on to my other point. First of all, that actually did talk to, that was a really good way of engaging, but not obviously in transformation, but engaging people. And secondly, this was a government that believes in just transition, but no oil workers had ever heard the term. So I thought Des's point was really useful, really important thing to think about, saying that there's going to be a jobs crisis in Edinburgh. But you put it alongside Anne's other points, which you say this transformation, this dealing with climate change, reducing emissions, can create so many jobs, and in the process of fixing people's homes. and giving them public transport, which they like and can use. So that's what I think Des is completely right to work out how deadly serious that is. And we put alongside the fact that if you do this massive investment, I was in a call, we've got to have, by 2030, we've got to ramp up investment in renewables and climate change stuff by 5 times, right? We've got to put more money into making these jobs so that, in a sense, that answers Des's question. Obviously, I don't think just saying it works it out, but it is, when we have a government which is shown its capacity to produce lots of money when it needs to, the ask that money is then put into creating those jobs is perhaps quite a lot easier. Just a couple of other points before I wind up. I thought Anne's point about the DWP is just really important. I just don't think we should ever forget the importance of looking after workers when they're unemployed. And I think the current philosophy of work first, which is they want you to get into any job as quickly as possible on any terms, is completely incompatible with this transformation, with a just transition, because that's got to upskill people. An absolutely crucial part of what we should be saying is we need an offer to workers, and that offer to workers has got to be that they can gain new skills which they can apply in this new green economy. Just a couple of other things. I was thinking about the government, and this is just a general comment, but that we do have an election coming up, and so I think getting clear our demands around this is a really important moment in Scotland. And I just copied into the chat the Just Transition Partnership sort of manifesto asks, and so I think we could have another whole discussion about how you use, if you can use the combination of the election and the COVID crisis to win some outcomes for us in that process. But I think it's completely true that probably Willie said it, he often says it, there is no substitute for organisation, right? It's absolutely no good having enough good ideas. Like I've copied you this manifesto. We've got some great ideas, a whole lot of things which the Scottish Government could do. It's not good enough. That is a necessary starter point, so you can convince people it's worth struggling for these, and there's a basis for organising. But it is actually always organisation on the ground which builds power, and that's the power we need to change society. And that, just ending up on that, I think there's a real danger in the way in which things like ideas like just transition and things like that get incorporated by government. And the more that government talks about just transition and doesn't do it, the more degraded the idea becomes in people's eyes. It's reasonable for workers in the oil and gas industry to be cynical about this conversation when we've had promises of new green jobs and they've not materialised. So I think we've got to hold on to the transformational possibilities of this moment where we link with the obviously enormous but unavoidable challenges of coming out of COVID through completely different ways of managing the economy from what the government has normally done. Linking that with the climate challenge, which is now, it is at last mainstream. Right? It is absolutely on the top of almost everyone's view. What are the crises we have to deal with? And the issues which we as trade unionists and socialists are well versed on. We connect that to people's challenges at work, connect that to the struggles for greater equity, to tackling inequalities and supporting people who are unemployed, helping communities overcome just poverty. So if we can, if we can combine that vision of a better world which solves all those problems and the capacity to organise around it, making all those links which we now see coming together, all those stuff about this climate strikers, the young people taking action, XR, trade unionists growing. There is a lot of potential there, and we have to buckle down and in our own unions and in our own workplaces and in our own cities, try and make that transformation happen.
Thank you very much. Pete, do you want the last word?
Okay, just very quickly, I agree absolutely with what Matthew just said. And I think the point Des made earlier on about the impact that COVID is having on Edinburgh is a really good one, because it seems to me that we need to combine, as Matthew said, we need to combine a vision of the scale of what we're trying to do and where we want to end up. But if we can't translate that into what that means in our own locality, then we're not doing a very good job, and we're not going to win hearts and minds. Because the truth is, at the moment in Edinburgh, the City Council, I don't think has any alternative, but when it talks about recovery, but to talk about, for example, that we go back to the old way of tourism in Edinburgh. Now, it's interesting, actually, another Edinburgh is Possible has just done a survey of a fairly large number of Edinburgh residents about things. And some of the responses on tourism are really interesting. We're going to try and publish them quite soon. But the point is that model of tourism is completely incompatible with any ambition to have a zero carbon economy. It just doesn't work at all. So we have to come forward with some ideas about what that might be like, but we have to not mince our words about that it's a red, you know, it's a dead end. It's not a way to go. But we have to take really, really seriously where we want to go. And I think the argument we have to win, both in local government and with central government, is that the public sector has got to have the leading role in this. Leaving everything to the private sector, which has been the strategy up to now, has been an abject failure. There are less jobs in sustainable industries in Scotland now than there were 5 years ago. And the trend is downwards, not upwards. We need to turn that around. We need to call a spade and actually name things for what they are and say, this can't go on like this. We have to have a serious role for the public sector. And people have got all kinds of ideas. I mean, in Scotty 3, we talked about a Scottish Climate Service. Other people got other names. And I really don't care about the name, but what's important about it is that it's strategic, it's holistic, and it's actually publicly funded and democratically controlled.
Thank you. Thanks so much for your contribution tonight, Pete and Matthew. You've really stimulated a really interesting conversation and stretched all our imagination. So thank you for that. I think a lot of us will be going back to our own unions and asking, why haven't we got green reps? Why haven't we got training for reps, environmental training for reps? And how are we going to organise ourselves to help this? So I think that just leaves me to wrap up and say thank you to everybody for your contributions tonight. It's been a fascinating debate and great to hear from so many people and to see your faces. So I hope to see you again in the future. I'll say goodbye.
Thanks to the chair. Thank you, Claire.
Thanks, Claire.